Welcome to MedMark's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Clinical Trials in the Time of COVID-19. I'm Kate Klaus, staff attorney in MedMark's Risk Management Department. On behalf of MedMark and today's presenters, Diane Bork and Benjamin Zegarelli, thank you for joining us. Diane Bork is a partner in the Boston office of MINTS. She advises a variety of healthcare clients on a broad range of issues, including licensure, regulatory, contractual, and risk management matters, and patient care. As former in-house counsel to an academic medical center, a large part of her practice involves counseling researchers and research sponsors in matters related to FDA and OHRP regulated clinical research, including patient consent, access to and use of tissue and associated patient information, and the institutional review board process. She also counsels healthcare clients and other business entities on a broad range of privacy and data security issues. She regularly assists clients with data breach response and mitigation, the implementation of HIPAA-mandated policies and procedures, privacy audits, third-party requests for information, and review of HIPAA-related contracts and forms. She has successfully defended clients in both civil and criminal HIPAA enforcement actions and regularly assists clients with the management of data breaches and other losses of protected health information. Before joining MINTS, Diane was an associate staff attorney at the Leahy Clinic, where she provided general counsel services to medical, professional, and administrative staff. She also served as counsel to the Institutional Review Board, the Ethics Committee, the Intellectual Property and Technology Transfer Committee, and the Genetics Advisory Board. Benjamin Zegarelli is an associate in the New York office of MINTS. He provides counsel on compliance and regulatory issues to clients in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech industries. With a clear focus on FDA regulatory counseling, Benjamin advises a breadth of healthcare industry clients on the federal and state laws surrounding manufacturer product development and marketing. His practice also includes advising clients on research approval, sales, and negotiating contractual relationships. Benjamin has experience representing medical device companies and responding to significant unfavorable inspection observations, sometimes accompanied by a warning letter. He guides companies with compliance issues through the development stage of action plans and implementing corrective actions. In his practice, Benjamin participates in the coordination of diligence reviews of transactions involving large pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers. He is well versed in the process of developing policy positions and submitting comments to the FDA, as well as analyzing and drafting 510(k) applications for submission to the FDA. Benjamin reviews and drafts clinical study agreements for clients, analyzing both clinical study and human factors protocols with respect to legal requirements. He previously worked as a research chemist in the discovery group of a major research-based healthcare and pharmaceutical company. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Diane.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome everybody. We're really happy that you've joined us today for this webinar. And before we get started, I just want to say on behalf of myself and Ben and our colleagues at MINTS that we hope that everyone is safe and healthy and faring well in this extraordinarily challenging time that seems to only be getting more challenging. Next slide, please. So as you can see from our agenda, we have a lot to cover with you today. We will try to save time for questions and discussions. We have learned throughout this pandemic that when people collaborate and talk to each other and communicate, we all fare much better. So we are going to try to make sure that there's time for that today. Next slide, please. So to set the stage, we want to start off with an overview of what things look like in the healthcare provider environment. And that's because research is conducted in healthcare facilities. So to understand what is going on with clinical trials, you really have to understand what's going on in the hospitals and the other patient care locations where they're being conducted. So COVID-19, as we're all aware, is a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. It has placed an overwhelming burden on the healthcare system. All over the country, waves of COVID patients have been peaking at different times. And where I am in Boston, where hopefully, knock wood, past peak and on the downward trend, But when there is a peak, healthcare institutions get absolutely bombarded with rapidly increasing daily numbers of COVID patients. A large numbers of these patients require intensive care as well as ventilator support. And we understand from our provider friends that the duration of time that COVID patients spend on a ventilator is much longer than patients would typically spend, which is why you've been hearing about all of these ventilator crises throughout the pandemic. Institutions in hard-hit locations have to convert nearly 100% of their operations and clinical efforts to COVID patient care. They convert regular beds to intensive care unit beds. There is an extremely heavy burden placed on pulmonary, infectious disease, critical care physicians, and hospitalists. Elective and urgent surgeries will stop, which has a huge effect on hospital profitability. Regular patient visits, when they do occur, have to convert to telemedicine. On the positive side, we have seen incredible collaboration among healthcare providers, regulators, and industry members in the healthcare system in facilitating care of these massive numbers of patients and also working towards vaccines and treatments for these patients. We really can't emphasize how remarkable it is to see, and we'll talk a lot about how regulators and others are trying to be accommodating during this time. The timing of conversion back to normal operations is very unclear. And even when it happens, it's unlikely that normal hospital operations will be nothing like what we're used to, given what everyone has been through and the fact that subsequent waves of cases are anticipated. So now during the pandemic, as you can imagine, Institutional Review Board, clinical research operations, they've all shifted to emphasize COVID research protocols, and almost all other types of research activities have been paused and deferred. We have not seen, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, we're not seeing new recruitment into studies. And when there are enrolled patients, these patients don't want to come in for study visits, and the providers don't want them there anyway. Regulators, hospitals, researchers, everybody's concerned with safety above everything else. So protocol compliance is extraordinarily difficult in this type of situation. So for example, if there's a lab test that's required or imaging that's required in connection with a study protocol, it can't happen, it won't happen because of the risk of infection. And either way, research staff are often redeployed, again, when you're in a peak type situation, to clinical care needs, and any available research resources are directed to COVID-related research. The COVID pandemic has been completely disrupted to CRO operations. But I guess the upside is that it has resulted in change to the status quo, and you'll hear that theme throughout our presentation about changes that probably will be sticking around with us, which is not a bad thing. CROs, like the rest of us, are working remotely and converting in-person meetings to video conference. Clinical monitors are not allowed into hospitals, in particular during the peak. So there's been a huge shift from on-site to remote monitoring, which is not necessarily a bad thing for study monitoring. CROs and sites are cooperating to put systems in place so that they can share study documentation and reduce the number of personnel that need to access a study site. There's an emphasis on risk-based monitoring, preservation, of trial endpoints, consideration of alternatives for trial analytics, and other efforts to create efficiencies, because of the circumstances that potentially that will also continue, on a going forward basis. So against this backdrop, We're next going to take a look at what the government is doing to try to help with really unprecedented regulatory flexibility and accommodation. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben to tell you about that.
Thanks, Diane. That was great stage setting, and welcome to everybody on the webinar. Happy to be here today to talk with you about this topic. So we're going to move from the picture on the ground to the much more abstract realm of regulatory measures and the types of accommodations that the federal government has made to help clinical trials move along during the pandemic. So since most clinical trials involve in-person participation by human subjects and usually require subjects to travel to an academic medical center that's actually conducting the trial, the COVID pandemic and state travel restrictions and quarantine requirements presented significant obstacles to continuing clinical trials according to their written protocols. I should note that, as Diane mentioned, although some states are currently reopening, there are likely to be continuing state and local restrictions and even certain requirements at the individual hospitals that affect clinical trials for the foreseeable future. But to soften the impact from the pandemic, federal agencies have stepped in to ease the burden on clinical trials by relaxing certain regulatory requirements. And in the next two slides, Diane and I will summarize the various accommodations federal agencies have been implementing to help ensure that the majority of clinical trials may continue during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So in particular, on March 18th, FDA issued a guidance recommending various options for clinical trial modifications to accommodate COVID-related disruptions. The guidance makes some key points concerning study subject safety and protocol modifications to address the lack of in-person visits. The first of these points being that study subject safety is the most important consideration, and both sponsors and sites need to consider the extent of new risks the novel coronavirus, the stay-at-home orders, and other consequences of the virus could have on enrolled subjects in the study itself. The extent of the risks can change based on multiple factors, some of which I have included on this slide, but FDA goes into much more detail in its guidance. But for example, depending on the nature of the investigational product and the disease state being studied, subjects could be at risk of severe complications if the specific circumstances prevent subjects from receiving the normal dosage under the protocol. So such as if there are supply issues or if there are restrictions based on the method of administration, like for instance, if the investigational product must be infused, and the subjects cannot go to the site for an in-person visit, there are obviously some complications, issues there that need to be worked through in terms of risk and how to accommodate that. Second, sponsors and sites should act to reduce any risks caused by the pandemic as much as possible. The guidance provides assurance that FDA will be flexible when it comes to implementing changes or amendments to the study protocol. And the particular example of that is that urgent protocol modifications or deviations to minimize or eliminate immediate hazards can be implemented right away without IRB or FDA authorization. The guidance also advises sponsors and sites to consider suspension or termination of some trials if the risk to study subjects is too great and cannot be mitigated effectively. And finally, the third major point from the guidance is that documentation of all COVID-related modifications is essential, including any failure to collect required data. Although immediate notice to FDA or the IRB is not necessary for urgent modifications or deviations to protect subjects, these changes should be thoroughly documented for submission to both bodies at a later date. However, certain major modifications, such as changes to the data collection methods or to the statistical analysis plan, should be discussed with the agency prior to implementation. And it's important to note that by this point, many clinical trial sponsors and sites have already implemented procedural changes and study modifications to address the issues and considerations in FDA's guidance. However, FDA continues to update the guidance by adding helpful information to its question and answer appendix, which I will briefly discuss on the next slide. So the question and answer appendix of the guidance is really useful because it describes current agency perspectives on common queries from sponsors and sites about continuing trials. And in fact, FDA has updated the appendix several times during the course of the pandemic to address important issues and questions sent to the agency's email address, which is dedicated to COVID-related clinical trials inquiries. FDA's responses to the questions offer recommendations for dealing with common problems in ways that comply with FDA regulations. We have included some of the major topics on this slide, but obviously you should consult the appendix itself for additional helpful, detailed information on a variety of relevant topics. If you have other questions that aren't covered in the appendix, you can always email a question directly to FDA using the address shown here. It's likely that FDA will continue to update this guidance every few weeks during the public health emergency as the agency gets new information on developing issues. So we recommend checking the guidance and FDA's updates, which are usually presented as FDA's daily roundup on COVID matters on a regular basis. This next point, the last point on the slide, doesn't specifically relate to the guidance, but it's important to mention here because it was addressed in one of FDA's recent updates, and I included it as an additional point on dealing with informed consent, which has been a particularly tricky issue for some studies since face-to-face interactions between investigators and study subjects aren't possible in many cases, and informed consent is traditionally something that has to happen in person. FDA recently announced that it has made its COVID My Studies app available as a possible option for obtaining informed consent electronically. So in addition to offering recommendations for staying compliant, FDA is also providing possible solutions that can address the needs of some sponsors and clinical sites. Next slide, please. And in some cases, FDA's solutions have taken the form of enforcement discretion, which is when the agency implements a policy not to enforce some or all requirements of the law to make it easier for companies to make and distribute much needed medical supplies, or in this case, to conduct clinical trials and use investigational products on study subjects. Enforcement discretion policies are limited, however, in that FDA establishes conditions or criteria for applying the discretion, which are intended to maintain safety and prevent undue risks to patients. So it's important to take note of what FDA has said surrounding the enforcement discretion policy, because usually there are requirements to meet in order to fall into the scope of the enforcement discretion. And this slide takes a closer look at a particular example of FDA exercising enforcement discretion in an area that affects clinical trials as well as patient treatment. So early on in the pandemic spread through the US, FDA issued a temporary enforcement policy on remote monitoring devices in the interest of finding technical solutions to put greater physical distance between healthcare professionals and COVID patients, and to support the use of telehealth solutions. The policy applies to the specific types of devices identified in the policy, which are devices that may communicate data over a wireless network to healthcare professionals. Although the following types of modifications would typically require pre-market notification, otherwise known as a 510K, prior to commercialization of the modified device, FDA does not intend to enforce this requirement for the types of modifications shown here, namely including claims or functionality relating to the monitoring of COVID-19 patients, changing a device indication to include home use, or hardware or software changes to increase remote monitoring capabilities. The caveat here is that these modifications must not create an undue risk to patients. And if they do, FDA will impose greater oversight or seek enforcement action if necessary. This enforcement discretion policy has helped ensure that routine procedures such as vital sign readings can be completed behind germ barriers from separate rooms or even from miles away, reducing the time of direct physical contact between COVID-19 patients and healthcare professionals. Clinical trials benefit from these changes as well, because they allow certain aspects of study subject safety assessments to be performed without in-person visits to the study site. Next slide, please. So this slide highlights other actions taken by federal agencies to allow greater regulatory flexibility for clinical trial sponsors and sites. For instance, the Office for Human Research Protection issued guidance relating to the common rule, which Diane will speak to on the next slide. And the office's website is directing people who want additional information about how to deal with the pandemic to FDA resources on clinical trials, which is an example of helpful agency coordination during the pandemic. National Cancer Institute programs also released interim guidance, which includes considerations for making investigational drugs available to subjects if in-person visits to study sites are not possible. And also, the Office for Civil Rights also relaxed HIPAA enforcement of teleconferencing platforms, which goes hand in hand with FDA's enforcement discretion for remote monitoring. Again, as I highlighted in the previous slide on FDA's clinical trial guidance, all of these federal interim policies emphasize that patient safety is paramount. And whenever any healthcare or research entity makes COVID-related changes to policies or procedures. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Diane.
Thank you, Ben. So I just want to talk a little bit about what the Office for Human Research Protections, OHRP, is doing with respect to clinical trials under its jurisdiction. And for those who are unfamiliar, just briefly, there are two almost identical sets of human subject protection rules. One set is enforced by FDA for research that is going to be submitted to FDA for marketing clearance. Not all research is for submission to FDA, so the other set of rules would apply to that research, and those rules are referred to as the common rule because they're research regulations that are adopted by NIH, but also 13 other federal agencies. So NASA follows the common rule, Department of Transportation follows the common rule. All these agencies conduct research, and they all follow these human subject protection rules when their research involves people. And incidentally, the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed right at the end of the Obama administration, mandates that FDA and OHRP harmonize their human subject protection rules, which has been a very long time coming. What is a little bit annoying about the two separate sets of rules is that they are almost identical, but not quite, and in some cases they conflict. So you can potentially have a study that is subject to both FDA and OHRP rules and get stumped from time to time when you have conflicting obligations under those rules. So eventually we'll have one set of rules, but for now we have different agencies that are involved in the protection of human subjects, and OHRP, which is responsible for the common rule, has taken a similar approach as FDA, prioritizing safety and offering really remarkable flexibility to researchers. And you can see some of the flexibility that was offered in guidance that OHRP published at the beginning of April in connection with COVID-19. Some highlights of this guidance are that OHRP has confirmed that when researchers are required, because this was confusing everybody, when researchers are required by law to provide information related to an individual's COVID-19 test status, for example, if they have to report to a local or a state public health authority keeping count of COVID cases, even when that disclosure involves identifiable information about study participants, researchers are permitted to make those types of disclosures, even if those disclosures would be inconsistent with the consent form that was signed by the study participants. OHRP has also expressly authorized investigators to implement changes to approved research, sort of like FDA, prior to institutional review board review and approval, when these changes are necessary to eliminate apparent immediate hazards to study participants. So for example, OHRP understands and fully expects investigators to cancel, as they have been doing, or postpone non-essential study visits or conduct phone visits instead of in-person visits in order to reduce COVID transmission risks. In these situations, ordinarily, this would be a protocol amendment that would require regulatory review, but under OHRP's COVID guidance, investigators are permitted to make those types of changes to reduce risks without IRB approval or a formal protocol amendment. They do, however, have to report those kinds of changes to the IRB after the fact when it's possible. OHRP guidance also includes a reminder that IRB imposed suspensions or terminations of research that was previously approved have to be reported to OHRP. So if the IRB suspends or terminates your study, it has to be reported to the federal government. The assumption here is that under ordinary circumstances, something has gone wrong or there's a health or safety risk to study participants that's pretty significant. However, if an investigator or an institution suspends or terminates research, that does not have to be reported to the federal government. It doesn't have to be reported to OHRP. And this is something that's important for research sponsors to keep in mind and to discuss with their sites when there are challenges presented by the pandemic to a ongoing research protocol. You don't want the IRB to be the one to suspend or pause your study over COVID-19 because of the regulatory implications. It's going to get reported to the government and everybody's going to think something's wrong with your study and that it's not the pandemic. Alternatively, you want the investigator or the institution, or preferably you can suspend your study. And we're going to talk later on about how important communications are and other practical, measures to just avoid situations like this that are avoidable, unnecessary, inferences that, something bad has happened and when it's really, pandemic related difficulties. Next slide, please. The NIH, which is where the Office of Human Research Protections lives, has also published a great deal of guidance for federally funded researchers and grant applicants. And like other federal agencies, they are trying to be accommodating and to work with researchers and recognize that there are really unprecedented challenges out there that everybody is struggling with. So on this slide, you can see excerpts and you can see links to this guidance if it is helpful to the type of research that your clients and customers are involved in or that you're involved in. Some of the highlights and really striking sort of steps that the NIH has taken to accommodate federally funded researchers here's a few examples. Financial reporting and research progress reports, which are on very strict schedules in ordinary circumstances, can be submitted late if it's necessary because of the pandemic. Grantees just have to let their program officials know that their reports will be late. If researchers are unable to work as a result of the pandemic, and if the researcher's institutional policy allows for the charging of salaries and benefits when no work is being performed, then charges for salaries and benefits can be made to NIH grant awards. It's important that the institution permits this, and there has to be documentation of that policy because NIH will probably go back and ask for documentation. But the ability to charge a grant for no work is a pretty remarkable accommodation by the federal government. Additionally, travel costs, costs for grant-related travel that has been canceled due to the pandemic can be charged to an existing NIH grant award if those charges would have otherwise been allowed. If researchers incur unanticipated costs as a result of the pandemic, NIH, for example, costs for relocating study participants to receive care at different sites or to receive care virtually, supply chain disruptions, loss of personnel due to illness or redeployment, additional lab testing, specifically COVID-19 testing, increased transportation costs, those types of things. If they are unanticipated and due to the pandemic, and there aren't unobligated balances that can be rebudgeted, federally funded researchers can ask for supplemental funds from their funding agency. Not everybody gets this extra funding to cover these losses, but requests are considered and additional grants are made on a case-by-case basis. If efforts have been made to support the safety and welfare of participants in the research study. And then finally, the Office of Animal Welfare, OLAW, has also published guidance because animal research has been, preclinical research has been impacted like everything else. And they've offered a series of FAQs to support institutional animal care and use programs during the pandemic, including, what do you do if an institution shuts down? Is there flexibility on mandated IACUC, Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee meetings? What options are there for conducting virtual tours of animal lab facilities that are mandated? Again, just pretty remarkable flexibility on regulatory requirements that are usually pretty solidly cast in stone. So now I'm going to turn it back to Ben to talk about considerations for conducting a COVID-19 related study.
Great, thanks, Diane. So we're going to turn now to sponsors and sites looking to initiate clinical trials relating to COVID-19. So as Diane mentioned at the beginning, resources for clinical trials in general are way down. But COVID trials in particular are critically important at this time to learning more about the virus and potentially developing a treatment or vaccine. And so are largely the only clinical research game in the country, and frankly, all over the world right now. So in light of that, I'd like to share some considerations for developing and initiating COVID-related research studies. Okay, great. So it's true that many non-COVID clinical trials have paused in one way or another, and many research projects have stalled, and the flow of new non-COVID research has slowed significantly during the pandemic. With respect to MINTS and our clients, Diane and I have heard from various people that various companies' non-COVID studies are in a holding pattern until further notice. And we expect that this is going to come back at some point, but right now there's just there are a lot of considerations, different risks associated with different trials, particularly high-risk disease states, therapeutics, things like that. So we expect those types of things to come back slowly, but at this time, there are a number of studies we know of that are holding off, suspended, or looking at other options. So academic medical centers and other clinical trial sites remain busy, though, not only because of the influx of COVID patients, but also because the number of clinical trials for possible COVID treatments, as well as studies seeking to understand the virus itself, continue to grow. Recent data shows that there are over 2,200 COVID-related studies registered with clinicaltrials.gov, and that globally, there are over 1,700 ongoing clinical trials studying treatments and vaccines for COVID-19. So these numbers are growing every day. And so it just shows you how many trials out there are getting started based on the patient population out there. Each new trial that comes up is important because, as I said, each one provides a chance that the patients who enroll as subjects may help identify a treatment that could benefit other COVID patients all over the world, or a vaccine that could keep others from ever getting the virus. So obviously, that's why so many researchers and companies are looking to jump in and do COVID-related trials. However, before initiating a clinical trial for a COVID treatment, sponsors should consider as many potential risks and safety hazards as possible. For instance, it's important to think through and plan out how the informed consent process will take place. Will the potential subjects already have COVID-19? And could interacting with those subjects or handling papers or other materials exposed to them endanger the investigators? What process is necessary to minimize these risks? FDA addresses these considerations and others in the Q&A appendix to its clinical trials guidance. So you can go there for some additional information. And as one example that FDA provides in that appendix, it's FDA will allow verbal confirmation by the subject on a three-way call with a witness and the investigator, followed by a witness attestation of the witness or a photograph of the signed informed consent in lieu of collecting the signed form itself. As I mentioned before, there are also other options for electronic signatures to inform consent documents. And there are other topics that FDA discusses in the appendix for relating to this physical contact and limiting that exposure to the investigators and potentially other patients. So that's definitely a good resource for this consideration. And then next, how will subjects receive the Oh, I'm sorry, not next slide. Still on the sponsors. Thank you. Next, how will the subjects receive the investigational product and how will it be administered? So if the subject is already in a hospital, this part is easier. But even so, the sponsor should consider the safety of the investigators when drafting the dosing process. If the study is allowing enrollment of COVID patients who are self-isolating at home, the logistics become even more challenging because they require delivery of the investigational product to the subject's home. And potentially self-administration or administration by some other feasible process, like with a healthcare provider or some other medical center. So then also, if in-person visits to the study site are not permissible, sponsors should anticipate that investigators will have to conduct remote safety assessments through phone calls, video platforms, or other means, and should draft the protocol to standardize those procedures as much as possible. In many cases, the pandemic has required a shift to virtual or telephone visits for clinical trial subjects. And while trials that were ongoing at the outset of the pandemic had to adapt to that new reality as they went, sponsors of new trials need to embrace those processes and develop protocols accordingly. The same is true for study monitoring, which in many cases can no longer be conducted in person. Virtual site monitoring is possible, though, and FDA provides some recommendations for switching to remote monitoring in its guidance. But briefly, all sponsors must be prepared to develop an efficient virtual monitoring process that allows the sponsor to review relevant documents and ask questions to identify potential compliance issues at the site. Next slide. So on this slide, we turn to considerations for the sites in deciding whether and how to participate in a clinical trial and conduct it, particularly for those trials relating to COVID-19. In large part, the sites have significant control over the performance of the study outside of the written study protocol, especially when it comes to procedures to reduce potential hazards to subjects and investigators. At a time when so many medical center resources are going towards treatment of highly infectious disease like COVID-19, it's critical that potential sites carefully examine the potential risk factors and complications the clinical trial poses for the institution, investigators, and the subjects. So these include considerations like weighing the benefits and risks of the investigational product, not only the product itself and potential side effects, but also the route of administration and the required processes in the protocol. And is the site able to perform those processes such that additional risks are minimized? And then also, is the site's IRB doing business as usual? Would there be a significant delay in getting the study through the IRB? Next, is the site allowing in-person visits for study subjects? If not, is the site prepared for virtual visits, subject safety assessments, and study monitoring? And then does the site have sufficient trained personnel and other resources to assign to the study? And finally, but this is not by any means an exhaustive list, does the site have adequate procedures in place to protect investigators? If the site does decide to go forward with the study, it should develop and implement adequate procedures for taking on and conducting new clinical trials, especially safety measures for investigators and subjects. These are not normal times, and the risks are high for everyone involved in the study. So sites need to make sure to implement procedures to address those risks, and then communicate those procedures to sponsors and confirm the sponsors will accept them, especially if the protocol does not incorporate similar safety measures. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Diane. Next slide, please.
Thank you. So we've hit you with a ton of information, and we want to talk a little bit about some practical things as you're soaking this all in. What can research sponsors and sites do given all of this backdrop as a practical matter? Next slide, please. So starting with sponsors, they need to, and they have been, from what we've seen, on an ongoing basis, assess existing trials to identify potential and actual risks and any necessary mitigations. And this has to be an ongoing process because the situation is rapidly evolving with respect to COVID. You know, we're in a different place right now than we were 2 weeks ago, and who knows where we're going to be 2 weeks from now. Similarly, guidance is rapidly evolving. We have not seen any of this flexibility that we discussed earlier get pulled back at all. But in almost all cases, it's been expanded or it's just stayed the same. But as things start to open up, you know, we're watching to see if any of it gets walked back at all. You know, we're encouraging sponsors to be really thoughtful about what they do with their, you know, ongoing research studies that are non-COVID related, keeping in mind that in some cases, given certain study populations, continuation of a study, notwithstanding the pandemic, is the safer option for study participants. Sponsors should think about supply chain issues, whether they can even get investigational product or other materials that they need. This is, again, I mean, everybody who's tried to have something shipped during the pandemic knows that it starts out all rosy when you order, and then all of a sudden 4 weeks later you still have no product. So that's an important consideration. Sponsors need to engage with their sites and their CROs to prevent the exercise of early termination rights. Most clinical trial agreements give study sites the option to terminate in the event of an unreasonable health or safety risk that the study presents to participants, and it could certainly be defensible that COVID-19 presents such a risk. So sites who feel like they're not getting you know, understanding or flexibility from their sponsors could absolutely terminate their studies. So suspension is a better option sometimes to termination. And again, as FDA has made clear, as Ben discussed, that a study suspension or a pause may not constitute may not require a protocol amendment. Sponsors should be establishing and assessing procedures for protecting study subjects and adjusting trial processes to account for COVID disruptions. So sponsors need to be thinking really creatively. Can they implement televisits or telemonitoring and take advantage of some of the FDA flexibility that Ben talked about in this area? Home visits, are those a reasonable alternative? We have clients that specifically, exclusively conduct home visits, and they're awfully busy lately throughout this pandemic. Can you move a study site to a new location altogether? And again, these types of changes might be protocol amendments that prevent imminent hazards to participants, not requiring FDA notice or IRB submission or approval, but that do require reporting after the fact. And then, of course, sponsors need to be mindful about documenting COVID-related disruptions and contingency measures and the reason why changes like the ones that I just discussed were made, so that, and the fact that they were made to keep participants safe, so that they can be reported after the fact as required. And finally, sponsors, when all else fails, at least take a look at what has been done pre-pandemic and to determine whether or not there's usable data that you could still collect and maybe salvage some, of the pre-COVID work that may have taken place. Next slide, please. So clinical trial sites, we are encouraging them to communicate with their sponsors and with CROs and with their IRBs to discuss the COVID impacts on a trial and any necessary deviations or modifications. And again, this needs to be an ongoing process. Sites should be proactive, not wait for sponsors to suggest alternatives and not assume that sponsors understand or appreciate the clinical circumstances that we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation. They should volunteer and offer suggestions. Communication is absolutely the key. Sites need to discuss protocol and process changes with study subjects to make sure that however they do it, they obtain informed consent for modifications that may require new or revised consent. Again, there's flexibility here, so you can obtain consent, but it doesn't have to be the written 35-page thing that we're all used to. Participant may or may not be able to provide written consent, but as we've discussed, regulatory authorities are giving us a lot of flexibility to find other ways to proceed. Sites should be evaluating alternatives as they're implemented, monitoring risks to study subjects and research personnel, and because sometimes termination is the right thing to do for the sake of safety. And we always encourage our study sites, and it's important for sponsors and others to remember that study participants are patients of the institutions, most often of the institutions that are conducting the research. And so the providers have a responsibility to those patients that takes precedence over their responsibility, for conducting a sponsor's clinical trial. And so the site decision-making with respect to safety is the final decision. It shouldn't come to loggerheads between sponsors and sites if there is that communication, ongoing communication and thoughtful discussion of, the concerns on both sides of the table. That's, what you ultimately want to avoid. Next slide, please. So now Ben and I are both going to talk a little bit about what it looks like beyond the pandemic. Hopefully 2021 is beyond the pandemic, but it may or may not be. So down the road, once we're on the other side of this, and hopefully we're on the other side of this, what are things going to look like? We definitely believe that with respect to clinical research, just like with a lot of changes that have occurred in clinical care, that we're never going to go back to the status quo and what we're used to. the pandemic has provided an opportunity to disrupt the norm and the way that everybody's sort of used to performing clinical trials. And so we fully expect that everybody who's involved in research is going to leverage what we're learning during this time of social distancing and remote work, and rapidly advancing video platforms such as the one that we're on right now. Ben and I did a webinar with a client who is a cardiac interventionalist at one of the big Boston hospitals, and who is also a researcher and medical director of a local CRO in Boston. And his view of all of this is that having to pivot to virtual investigator meetings and virtual trainings and virtual proctoring, virtual monitoring because of the pandemic has made him and his fellow researchers think, why did we ever not do this virtually? Like, why do we all fly, across the country to a ballroom for a 3-hour investigator meeting and then fly home when we could all just get on Zoom and have that same meeting? Because, changes like virtual meetings and eliminating unnecessary travel and on-site personnel, for different steps of trial execution, site initiation visits, monitoring, closeout visits, etc. All of those have the effect, the impact of making research more efficient and less expensive, which frees up resources to support patients, support more research for therapies and products that help patients. So we're expecting a lot of these practices to just continue because they make a great deal of sense, and I don't know that we ever would have pivoted like we did absent the pandemic. We're hoping that guidance, some of the regulatory flexibility that the government has offered that clearly hasn't killed anyone, maybe some of that will stay. We would like for some of that to stay around for sure. But that remains to be seen. And there's no, unfortunately, timetable for that. Ben, I don't know if you had some thoughts to add on what it's going to look like on the other side of this.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a great summary to start, and to go through the high level of what that's going to look like. I mean, I certainly agree with everything you said, Diane. I think it's interesting to look at it from the safety perspective too, because all of these agencies sort of had this idea of like, oh, well, if you do the analog process, everything's done in person, and you have these like, these very meticulous processes to, make sure everybody understands everything, especially with informed consent and, formalizing all these interactions, that was the safest way to go. I think, certainly in this case, necessity has been, well, it's not the mother of invention, then at least acceptance, because, the federal government has been, as we've shown, has been pretty flexible in this time. And I think this time is going to show the various federal agencies that, there is no real significant drop off in safety by conducting all of these processes remotely. Now, of course, there are some things that will still need to be done in person, certain clinical assessments, things like that. But, I think this is really going to be the real advent of digital healthcare and really this sort of transition to a telehealth environment where the government agencies are much more accepting of the types of things that can be conducted virtually, and that they do have a positive impact on patient well-being, and as you said, costs, getting all of this done more efficiently. So I think this has been, while it's been a particularly harrowing time for the country in general, at the end of it, I think we'll be in a position to really leverage these technologies in a good way for clinical trials and for general healthcare going forward.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So what do we have here? We've got 5 minutes. Okay, we didn't leave as much as we had hoped, but we do have 5 minutes for questions if there are questions. And
okay. Well, thank you both so much. We do have a few questions that have been submitted. First, are there any additional requirements for COVID-19 testing during a clinical trial?
So I can take this first, Diane, and then you can jump in if you have anything to add. There are no federal agency requirements relating to COVID-19 screening. So if you're enrolling into a clinical trial or you already have subjects enrolled, there's no real requirement to screen them for COVID-19. But if the sponsor or the site wishes to implement COVID-19 screening for current or future subjects as part of the trial, that requirement should be documented and presented as a deviation to an ongoing trial or written into the original protocol for a new clinical trial. The screening process should be fully documented and described in a relevant procedure, and that should include the chosen method of screening, so the particular type of test that's being done and how that will be administered, and that should be the same for all study subjects. So Diane, you can jump in here if you have anything else.
yeah, the only thing that I would add is just a reminder that as we discussed earlier in the presentation, that if screening is implemented and there's a requirement to report those test results, it's okay to report those test results. It's not a regulatory issue.
Yep.
Okay. Are there any specific changes or effects for pediatric trials?
Not that I'm aware of. Diane, have you seen anything specifically relating to pediatric trials?
No, I think they're subject to the same considerations as all other trials. There are always, I mean, pediatric trials are a unique bird. They're always subject to special, special consent requirements and other protections, because they're obviously a vulnerable population of research subjects. But I have not seen anything pediatric study specific.
Yeah, and of course, relating to the specific study population, just like all assessment of risks for any pediatric trial, you need to consider the specific risks to pediatric subjects and take those into account when you're figuring out how to modify a protocol or set up a deviation. So I mean that's an important aspect, but as long as you're doing that, it should be okay.
Okay. Have there been any recommendations put forth for accommodations for subjects who do not have internet access if clinic visits and other clinical trial monitoring is being conducted through a virtual platform?
Yeah, so this is a particular problem, right? Because a lot of the various accommodations we talked about are online, electronic in nature. So if a subject doesn't have access to the internet and also can't do an in-person clinic visit, that's going to be a problem for some studies. So that'll be a risk factor that the sponsor and the site would have to consider consider in terms of adequate mitigations and what needs to be implemented to ensure the safety of that subject. So if a subject doesn't have access to the internet or doesn't have sufficient connection bandwidth to support like a virtual safety assessment, so like by video, and assuming that a telephone assessment is inadequate, the sponsor and the site may have to determine that the the subject should be disenrolled from the study. And depending on the nature of the investigational product and the required process for discontinuing use, the sponsor and the site may have to arrange for an in-person safety visit at the subject's home or at an alternative medical center or a physician's office to ensure that that subject's safety through the dosage tapering and termination process. And Diane, feel free to jump in with anything else.
Yeah, I've not seen anybody address that type of issue. It's a really important question, a great question. We certainly have had and have seen sponsors providing devices to participants so that they can take advantage, whether it be a tablet of some sort or other hardware, so that they can participate in remote monitoring and participate remotely in the study. I suppose that if it was possible, I don't even know if could they provide a hotspot? I suppose if it's technically possible, a sponsor could consider making internet access available to a participant. But I actually haven't seen that done. I don't know how it would be done. I think probably the approaches that Ben suggested are the better ones. Is there another way to accommodate this patient, in a way that's safe?
Okay, and I think we have one last question. This is about the outlook after the public health emergency is lifted. Is there any expectation that these clinical trial accommodations might become fully or semi-permanent, or how changes in policy that are happening now might affect clinical trials after the emergency is lifted?
Yeah, that's certainly, we're wondering the same thing too. And it feels like it's going to, from our perspective, it feels like it's going to be very difficult for the government to walk back a lot of this flexibility because, it hasn't resulted in disaster. Like the government has allowed things to happen that it usually doesn't allow, and everybody's okay. Certainly the flexibility with respect, you can't believe how regulated and how difficult telemedicine has been prior to the pandemic. And those restrictions were lifted to facilitate telemedicine and virtual care. And everybody's fine. In fact, everybody's better than fine because they've avoided exacerbating a really bad situation with the pandemic. So our hope is that a lot of these changes, not all of them, because certainly some, especially on the FDA side, are pretty far out there and not going to be permanent. But our hope is that a lot of what has been permitted will remain available as a flexibility going forward.
Yeah, just to jump in there on this, I think, I agree with all of that, of course, but just in terms of the FDA, yeah, they've formulated a lot of these different policy changes to end as soon as the public health emergency declaration is over. So the FDA does have already basically a sunset in there to take all of these policies away potentially. But the real issue too is even if the emergency is done, it seems as though we've entered a time where for the next few years at least, everyone is going to be pretty sensitive and on edge to either COVID-19 returning seasonally every year or in cycles, or whether there'll be another pandemic. So I think it would certainly be an advantage to FDA and to everyone else involved with clinical trials if FDA really considers how to extend these policies into the future to make sure that these accommodations are more permanent in some form. So I mean, I really think that should, that the agency will consider that and how to do that. And then we should, I'm pretty sure we'll see some form of these accommodations continue. And as Diane said, nobody's gotten hurt so far, and that's what FDA likes to see. They like to use that evidence to say, like, they're a science-based organization, so they say, look, we did this out of necessity, but it looks like it worked pretty well in general. So maybe there'll be a phase-in approach for these types of accommodations for different types of trials, to just sort of be like a pilot program to see what happens with other types of trials. But I think I think it would definitely be a good thing if those continue.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for your time and this information today. You've covered quite a lot, and I know the presentation will be very valuable to our audience. Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.